The alarm screamed through the corridors of Stellar Command Academy, its piercing wail cutting through the morning silence like a plasma blade. Cadet Marcus Chen jolted awake in his cramped dormitory pod, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, alien cadets of various species stirred with practiced efficiency, their movements fluid and coordinated. Marcus fumbled for his uniform, his human reflexes embarrassingly slow compared to his roommates. "Another drill dirt crawler?" sneered Vextar, a tall Zenthari with crystalline skin that reflected the emergency lighting in sharp, prismatic patterns. His voice carried the typical condescension that Marcus had grown accustomed to over his 3 years at the academy. The Zenthari's forearms moved in perfect synchronization as he dressed, each limb performing a different task with mechanical precision. Marcus said nothing, pulling on his boots with deliberate calm. He had learned early that responding to the taunts only made things worse. In a galaxy where humans were considered the newest and least impressive species to achieve spaceflight, being the only human at the most prestigious military academy in the Galactic Coalition meant enduring constant reminders of his supposed inferiority. The corridor outside buzzed with activity as hundreds of cadets from dozens of species rushed toward their assigned stations. Marcus caught glimpses of towering Garathians with their stone-like skin, graceful Solari whose movements seemed to defy gravity, and compact Nexians whose cybernetic implants glowed softly in the dim lighting. Each species had evolved for space combat in ways that humans simply hadn't. The Zenthari possessed natural reflexes that could process information at superhuman speeds. The Garathians had skin tough enough to survive brief exposure to vacuum. The Solari could withstand G-forces that would liquefy human organs. And then there were humans. Slow, fragile, limited to a single pair of arms and eyes that could only see a fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. Marcus had read the reports. In every measurable category, humans ranked near the bottom among coalition species. The only reason they had been accepted into the galactic community at all was their recent invention of the quantum tunnel drive, a breakthrough that even the ancient Nexians admitted was impressive. Formation Delta 7, report to Bay 12 immediately, announced Commander Thexel over the intercom system. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent centuries leading space battles. As a Nexian, she had been alive longer than human civilization had existed. Her consciousness transferred between various synthetic bodies as technology advanced. Marcus jogged through the Academy's gleaming corridors, passing massive viewports that revealed the swirling nebula surrounding the station. Stellar Command Academy hung in space at the edge of Coalition territory, a massive structure that served as both training facility and first line of defense against the mysterious entities known only as the Devourers. For 500 years, the Coalition had maintained an uneasy peace with these beings, but recent intelligence suggested that might be changing. Bay 12 housed the Academy's training fighters, sleek vessels designed to simulate real combat conditions. Marcus approached his assigned craft, a standard Coalition interceptor painted in the yellow stripes that marked it as a training vessel. The cockpit had been modified to accommodate human physiology, one of the few concessions the Academy had made for their unusual student. Chen. The voice belonged to flight instructor Zara Ak, a battle-scarred Garathian whose stone-like features bore the marks of countless engagements. "You'll be flying solo today. Your usual wingmen requested different assignments." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. It wasn't the first time his squadron mates had found excuses to avoid flying with him. His reaction times were too slow, they claimed. His maneuvers were unpredictable. He couldn't keep up with formation flying, when every other pilot could process tactical information 3 times faster than any human brain. The fighter's cockpit sealed around him with a soft hiss, and Marcus began his pre-flight checklist. His hands moved across the controls with practiced familiarity, even as his mind wandered to the conversation he'd overheard in the mess hall the previous evening. A group of senior cadets had been discussing the upcoming graduation trials, and more than one had suggested that perhaps it was time for humans to reconsider their place in the Coalition military. "All units, prepare for combat simulation 7-7 Alpha," came Commander Thexel's voice through the comm system. "Today's exercise will test your ability to respond to an unknown threat using standard patrol formations. Threat parameters are classified." Marcus guided his fighter out of the bay and into the surrounding space, where dozens of other training craft had formed neat formations. The exercise area had been marked with holographic buoys, creating a three-dimensional arena roughly the size of a small moon. In the distance, the Academy's defensive platform stood ready to monitor the simulation and provide assistance if needed. The first wave of simulated enemies appeared without warning, materializing from behind asteroids and debris fields like mechanical predators. Marcus watched his tactical display as his fellow cadets responded with textbook precision, their formations shifting and adapting to meet the threat with choreographed efficiency. Plasma fire lit up the darkness as the mock battle began in earnest. Marcus found himself on the periphery of the main engagement, his slower reflexes leaving him behind as his squadron mates engaged the enemy with lightning-fast coordination. He fired when he could, scored a few hits on slower-moving targets, but mostly tried to stay out of the way and avoid friendly fire. It was a familiar routine, one that had defined his 3 years at the Academy. Then something changed. The simulation parameters shifted abruptly, and new contacts appeared on every cadet's tactical display. These weren't the standard training drones they'd been expecting. The energy signatures were wrong, the movement patterns unlike anything in the Coalition database. "This is not a drill," Commander Thexel's voice cut through the comm chatter, her usual calm replaced by sharp urgency. "All units, we have unknown contacts approaching the Academy. These are not simulation craft. Repeat, this is not a drill." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he processed the implications. Real enemies here at the Academy. The legendary Devourers perhaps finally making their move after centuries of silence. Around him, cadet voices filled the comm channels with confusion and panic as training formations dissolved into chaos. The first enemy craft came into visual range, and Marcus understood immediately why the tactical computers couldn't identify them. They seemed to shift and flow like living metal, their surfaces reflecting nothing while somehow absorbing all light that touched them. They moved with impossible grace, ignoring the basic laws of physics that governed normal spacecraft. And they were heading directly for the Academy, where thousands of cadets and instructors waited in what had suddenly become a death trap. The enemy ships moved like nightmares given form, their dark hulls seeming to bend space around them as they approached the Academy. Marcus watched his tactical display with growing horror as red contacts multiplied across the screen, each one representing a threat unlike anything the Coalition had ever encountered. The mysterious craft seemed to phase in and out of normal space, appearing in one location only to vanish and reappear somewhere else entirely. "All training squadrons, fall back to defensive positions around the Academy," Commander Thexel ordered, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Senior cadets form up on the defensive platforms. Junior cadets return to base immediately." Marcus hesitated, his fighter hanging motionless in space as chaos erupted around him. As a third-year cadet, he technically qualified as senior, but everyone knew he was barely keeping up with the curriculum. His squadron mates were already accelerating toward the Academy's defensive perimeter, their ships moving in perfect formation despite the crisis. Nobody had bothered to include him in their tactical planning. The first wave of enemy fighters reached the outer training area, and Marcus got his first close look at the legendary Devourers. The ships defied every principle of engineering he'd studied. They had no visible engines, no apparent weapon systems, yet they moved with predatory grace and fired beams of energy that seemed to unravel matter at the molecular level. When they hit a training drone, the target didn't explode or burn. It simply ceased to exist, leaving behind empty space where solid matter had been moments before. A wing of Zenthari cadets engaged the leading enemy fighters, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to react faster than any human could follow. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as the alien pilots executed maneuvers that would have killed him instantly, pulling G-forces that should have been impossible to survive. Their plasma cannons lit up the darkness with brilliant displays of coordinated firepower. It wasn't enough. The Devourer ship seemed to anticipate every attack, sliding through the defensive fire like ghosts through walls. When they returned fire, their weapons cut through Coalition shields as if they didn't exist. Marcus watched in horror as Cadet Zexnari's fighter simply vanished, consumed by a beam of dark energy that left no debris, no explosion, just empty space where his rival had been flying moments before. "Unknown craft, this is Stellar Command Academy," came a new voice over the emergency channel. Admiral Corthon, the Academy's commander, speaking directly to the enemy. You are in violation of Coalition space. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. The response came not in words but in action. The enemy formation split into multiple groups, each one targeting a different section of the Academy's defensive grid. Their ships moved with inhuman coordination, executing complex battle plans with mechanical precision. It became clear that this wasn't a random attack or scouting mission. This was a carefully planned assault designed to cripple the Coalition's primary military training facility. Marcus found himself forgotten in the chaos, his slow human reflexes making him irrelevant to the main battle. He watched senior cadets and instructors launch desperate counterattacks, their advanced fighters equipped with military-grade weapons and shields. The Garathian Heavy Assault Squadron punched through enemy lines with brute force, their reinforced hulls absorbing damage that would have vaporized lighter craft. Solari interceptor pilots danced through enemy fire with impossible grace, their natural ability to sense gravity fluctuations giving them an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. But for every small victory, the Coalition forces suffered greater losses. The enemy seemed to learn from each engagement, adapting their tactics in real time to counter whatever strategy the defenders employed. When the Nexians tried to overwhelm them with superior technology, the Devourers simply phased through their attacks. When the Zenthari attempted to outmaneuver them with speed, the enemy matched their every move with mechanical precision. Academy Control, "This is Emergency Channel Alpha," came a panicked voice from one of the outer defensive platforms. "We're being overwhelmed. Enemy craft are breaking through the perimeter. They're heading for the main station." Marcus realized with growing dread that the Academy itself was the target, not just the training facilities or the defensive platforms, but the massive station that housed over 50,000 cadets, instructors, and support staff. If the enemy reached the main structure, it would be a massacre on an unimaginable scale. He watched his tactical display as the defensive lines collapsed one by one. The enemy had somehow managed to cut off communications between Coalition units, isolating groups of defenders and destroying them piecemeal. Senior cadets who should have been coordinating their attacks found themselves fighting individual battles against a coordinated enemy force. A new contact appeared on Marcus's scanner, larger than the fighters but moving with the same unnatural grace. As it came into visual range, he saw that it was some kind of command ship, its dark hull pulsing with energy patterns that hurt to look at directly. The vessel was heading straight for the Academy's main docking bay, where evacuation shuttles were attempting to launch with civilian personnel. 3 Coalition interceptors moved to intercept the command ship, their pilots executing a textbook pincer maneuver. Marcus recognized the lead pilot's call sign, Commander Velish, one of the Academy's most decorated instructors. Her squadron had destroyed more enemy fighters in the last 10 minutes than any other unit, and her tactical brilliance was legendary throughout the Coalition military. The enemy command ship didn't even slow down. As the Coalition fighters closed to attack range, something extraordinary happened. The space around the enemy vessel seemed to fold in on itself, creating a localized distortion that trapped the attacking fighters in a gravity well of impossible intensity. Marcus watched in horror as 3 of the finest pilots in the galaxy were compressed into nothingness, their ships and bodies crushed by forces beyond comprehension. "All units, this is Admiral Corthan," came the commander's voice, heavy with defeat. "Begin emergency evacuation procedures. The Academy is lost. Repeat, the Academy is lost. All personnel are to evacuate immediately." Marcus stared at his tactical display, watching red contacts swarm toward the Academy like antibodies attacking an infection. In less than an hour, the most advanced military installation in Coalition space had been reduced to a lost cause. The defenders who remained were scattered and demoralized, their coordinated resistance broken by an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of space and time. But something nagged at the back of Marcus's mind as he prepared to follow evacuation protocols. The enemy's attack pattern, their movement formations, even the way they had systematically dismantled the Coalition's defenses, it all seemed familiar somehow. Like a puzzle he'd seen before but couldn't quite remember how to solve. That's when he noticed something the other pilots had missed. The enemy ships weren't random in their targeting. They were specifically hunting the most advanced Coalition fighters, the ones equipped with the latest technology and piloted by the most skilled cadets. They seemed to be learning, adapting, evolving with each engagement. But they were also following patterns, subtle ones that became apparent only when viewed from a distance. Marcus realized he might be the only pilot in position to see those patterns, the only one far enough from the main battle to observe the enemy's overall strategy. His slow human reflexes, his inability to keep up with formation flying, his position on the periphery of every engagement, all the things that made him a failure as a coalition pilot might be exactly what was needed now. Marcus studied the tactical display with growing understanding, his human mind processing the enemy's attack patterns in ways his alien classmates couldn't. While his fellow cadets reacted with lightning-fast reflexes to immediate threats, his slower thought processes allowed him to see the bigger picture. The Devourers weren't just attacking randomly. They were conducting what looked like a systematic data-gathering operation disguised as an assault. Every time a coalition pilot tried a new maneuver or fired a different type of weapon, the enemy ships seemed to record and analyze the tactic before developing a counter. They were learning at an incredible rate, building a comprehensive database of coalition military capabilities. But their learning process followed logical patterns, and patterns could be exploited. Academy Control, this is Cadet Chen. Marcus transmitted on the emergency frequency. I need to speak with Admiral Corthan immediately. The response came from a harried communications officer. Chen, get off this channel. Emergency evacuations are in progress. Return to base immediately. Negative, Marcus replied, watching as another group of enemy fighters systematically destroyed a defensive platform. I've identified tactical patterns in the enemy attack formation. I need to speak with command. There was a pause, then Admiral Corthan's voice came through the comm. Cadet Chen, you have 30 seconds. Make it count. Marcus took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. Sir, the enemy isn't trying to destroy the academy. They're using it as a testing ground. Every defensive tactic we employ, they analyze and counter. They're building a complete tactical database of coalition military capabilities. Explain. The Admiral's voice was sharp with interest. Watch their targeting priorities, Marcus continued, highlighting sectors on his tactical display. They consistently engage our most advanced fighters first, the ones with experimental weapons and enhanced capabilities. They're deliberately triggering our best pilots to use their most sophisticated tactics. When Cadet Velish attempted a quantum displacement attack, they had a counter ready within seconds. That's not possible unless they were specifically waiting for that tactic. The comm channel was silent for a long moment. Then, what are you suggesting, Cadet? Marcus felt his heart racing as he formulated his theory. They're machines, sir. Artificial intelligences of some kind. They learn by observing and adapting, but they follow programming constraints. If we can feed them false data or tactics they can't adapt to, we might be able to confuse their learning algorithms. Chen, we've lost half our defensive force in the last 20 minutes. We don't have time for theoretical discussions. Give me a chance, Admiral, Marcus said urgently. Let me test my theory. If I'm wrong, you've lost one obsolete human cadet. If I'm right, you might save the academy. Another pause, longer this time. Marcus could hear background chatter as evacuation procedures continued. Finally, Admiral Corthan spoke again. Chen, you are hereby granted temporary field commission as acting lieutenant. You have authorization to engage enemy forces at your discretion. Don't make me regret this. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline as he adjusted his fighter's course toward the enemy formation. His plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Instead of trying to outfly or outfight the enemy ships, he would do something completely unpredictable. Something that violated every principle of space combat he'd been taught. He began flying badly. Deliberately, systematically badly. Marcus executed maneuvers that no trained pilot would ever attempt, turning his fighter into what appeared to be a random, chaotic threat. He fired his weapons at seemingly empty space, accelerated when he should have decelerated, and broke every rule of formation flying. To any observer, it would look like panic or system malfunction. The enemy response was immediate and telling. A group of 3 Devourer fighters broke off from their main formation and moved to intercept what they must have perceived as a damaged coalition vessel. Marcus watched them approach, noting how they moved with typical mechanical precision, analyzing his erratic flight pattern and attempting to predict his next movement. But there was no pattern to predict. Marcus wasn't following any tactical doctrine or responding to logical stimuli. He was flying on pure human instinct, making decisions based on intuition rather than training. When the enemy ships tried to anticipate his maneuvers, he was already somewhere else entirely. Not because he was faster or more skilled, but because he was completely unpredictable. The first enemy fighter fired, its dark energy beam cutting through space where Marcus's ship should have been. But Marcus had already rolled away in a direction that made no tactical sense, his human mind operating on patterns that no artificial intelligence could analyze. The enemy's second shot missed by an even wider margin, and Marcus could almost sense their confusion as their targeting systems failed to lock onto his erratic flight path. "This is impossible," he heard Instructor Zara Ak's voice over the comm. "Chen, what are you doing?" "Flying like a human," Marcus replied, pulling a maneuver that should have torn his fighter apart but somehow didn't. "Admiral, I need every remaining pilot to do exactly what I'm doing. Abandon all tactical doctrine. Fly on instinct alone." "Cadet, that's suicide," came another voice. "No," Marcus said, watching as the enemy fighters struggled to adapt to his random movements. "That's humanity." He opened fire on the nearest Devourer ship, not aiming for any specific system or weak point, just shooting where his gut told him to shoot. The plasma bolt struck the enemy vessel in what appeared to be empty hull space, but the ship immediately began spinning out of control, dark energy bleeding from its core systems. "Impossible," Admiral Corthon breathed. "Chen, how did you know where to shoot?" Marcus didn't have a good answer. He'd fired based on nothing more than instinct, a feeling that something about that particular section of hull looked wrong. It wasn't logical or scientific. It was purely human intuition operating at a level beyond conscious thought. "All remaining units," Admiral Corthon's voice carried across the emergency channel with new authority. "You heard the lieutenant. Abandon standard tactics. Fly like humans." The order must have sounded insane to the alien pilots, but they followed it anyway. Marcus watched as coalition fighters throughout the battle zone suddenly began moving in completely unpredictable patterns. Centauri pilots, used to processing information at superhuman speeds, forced themselves to slow down and act on impulse. Garathian heavy fighters abandoned their traditional brute force tactics in favor of random, chaotic maneuvers. The effect on the enemy was immediate and devastating. The Devourer ships, which had been adapting to and countering every coalition tactic with mechanical efficiency, suddenly found themselves facing opponents who had no tactics at all. Their learning algorithms designed to analyze and predict logical military behavior couldn't process the random, intuitive actions of pilots flying on pure instinct. Marcus destroyed his second enemy fighter by firing at what looked like empty space, trusting his human intuition over his instruments. The dark energy beam that should have vaporized his ship passed harmlessly through space where his fighter would have been if he'd followed logical, evasive patterns. Around him, the tide of battle was turning. Coalition pilots who had been systematically outmaneuvered and destroyed were now scoring hits against an enemy that couldn't adapt to illogical human behavior. The Devourer's greatest strength, their ability to learn and counter any tactic, had become their greatest weakness when faced with opponents who weren't following any tactics at all. The space around Stellar Command Academy had transformed into a chaotic ballet of impossible maneuvers and instinctive combat. Marcus watched in amazement as his fellow cadets embraced the madness he'd initiated, their ships dancing through enemy formations with moves that defied every principle of tactical doctrine. A Celari pilot named Cathara had somehow managed to fly her interceptor in a corkscrew pattern that should have torn the ship apart, but instead allowed her to slip through a wall of enemy fire unscathed. The Devourer ships were clearly struggling with this new development. Their movements had become erratic, almost frantic, as their learning algorithms tried unsuccessfully to process tactical data that made no logical sense. Marcus observed with growing confidence that his theory was correct. These were artificial intelligences, incredibly advanced ones, but still bound by the limitations of programmed logic. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Corthon's voice crackled through the comm, "whatever you've started, it's working. Enemy formation integrity is breaking down across all sectors." Marcus rolled his fighter through a maneuver that had no name, because no sane pilot would ever attempt it, somehow avoiding 3 separate enemy targeting locks in the process. "Admiral, I need to reach the command ship," the large vessel heading for the main docking bay. "If I'm right about their nature, that's their central processing unit." "Negative, Chen. That ship destroyed Commander Velish's entire squadron. You'd be flying into certain death. With respect, sir, Commander Velish was flying like a trained military officer. That's exactly what got her killed. Marcus adjusted his course toward the enemy command vessel, which was now visible as a dark shape against the Academy's hull. These things can't adapt to human unpredictability. The more irrational I am, the safer I become. As if to prove his point, a Devourer fighter attempted to intercept his approach, firing its disintegration beam where tactical calculations predicted he would be. Marcus responded by doing something no rational pilot would ever do. He accelerated directly toward the enemy weapon, rolling his ship at the last possible moment to let the beam pass harmlessly beneath his hull. The enemy ship, programmed to expect logical evasive maneuvers, was completely unprepared for a target that deliberately flew into danger. "This is insane," came Instructor Zara Ak's voice. "Chen, you're flying like a madman." "Exactly," Marcus replied, opening fire on the confused enemy fighter. His plasma bolt struck home, and the Devourer ship simply ceased to exist, unraveled by the same forces it had been using to destroy coalition vessels. Madness is the one thing they can't compute. The enemy command ship loomed larger as Marcus approached, its dark hull rippling with patterns that made his eyes water. The vessel was massive, easily 10 times the size of any coalition fighter, and bristling with weapon systems that operated on principles beyond current understanding. Several smaller fighters moved to protect it, but they seemed confused by Marcus's approach vector, which violated every rule of attack formations. "All units, this is Lieutenant Chen," Marcus transmitted on the general frequency. "I'm making an attack run on the command ship. I need complete radio silence after this transmission. Any communication might give their algorithms data to work with." He switched off his comm system entirely, trusting his fellow pilots to understand the implications. The enemy ships had been learning not just from their actions, but from their communications as well. By maintaining complete silence, they would deny the artificial intelligence's valuable tactical information. Marcus's fighter screamed toward the command ship at maximum velocity, his approach so reckless that even the advanced Devourer targeting systems couldn't predict his intentions. He wasn't following any attack pattern from the tactical manuals. He wasn't even sure what he planned to do when he reached the enemy vessel. He was simply flying on pure human instinct, trusting his mind to find solutions that no computer could anticipate. The command ship's weapons opened fire, dark energy beams cutting through space in precise geometric patterns designed to create an inescapable kill zone. Any rational pilot would have been vaporized instantly, but Marcus wasn't flying rationally. He rolled and twisted through the weapon's fire like a leaf in a hurricane, his movements guided by intuition rather than calculation. As he closed the distance to the command ship, Marcus suddenly understood what his instincts had been trying to tell him. The enemy vessel's hull wasn't solid matter at all. It was some kind of energy construct held together by complex force fields. And force fields had resonance frequencies that could be disrupted if you knew exactly where to hit them. He didn't know how he knew where to shoot. There was no logical basis for his targeting decision, no tactical manual that could have guided him to the specific point on the enemy hull that seemed to call out to his human intuition. But as his plasma cannons fired, he was absolutely certain he was aiming at the right spot. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The command ship's hull began to unravel like a complex knot being pulled apart, its energy matrix collapsing in cascading waves of light and shadow. The vessel that had seemed invincible moments before was now coming apart at the seams, its advanced technology failing in ways its creators had never anticipated. Throughout the battle zone, the remaining Devourer ships began to behave even more erratically. Without their command vessel to coordinate their actions, they seemed lost, their movements becoming random and disorganized. Marcus watched in amazement as coalition pilots pressed their advantage, their intuitive flying styles proving devastatingly effective against enemies who could no longer adapt or learn. But the victory came with a cost. As the command ship collapsed, it released a burst of energy that washed over Marcus's fighter like a tidal wave. His instruments went dark, his engines failed, and his life support systems began showing critical warnings. The ship that had carried him through the most important battle of his life was now a drifting hulk, powerless and dying. Marcus found himself floating in the darkness of his disabled cockpit, watching through the canopy as the last of the Devourer ships either retreated or were destroyed by the revitalized coalition forces. The Academy was safe, its evacuation shuttles returning to dock as the immediate threat passed. He had done something that the finest pilots in the galaxy couldn't accomplish. He had single-handedly turned the tide of an impossible battle. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years he had been the Academy's failure, the slow human who couldn't keep up with his alien classmates. His reflexes were too sluggish, his thinking too primitive, his capabilities too limited. But those very limitations had become his greatest strengths when faced with an enemy that could adapt to any logical response. Emergency. Lights began flashing on his control panel as his oxygen levels dropped to critical levels. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling strangely peaceful despite his dire situation. He had finally found his place in the galaxy, even if it might be the last thing he ever did. The misfit human had become the hero, not by overcoming his limitations, but by embracing them completely. Through his comm system, which had somehow managed to reboot itself, he heard Admiral Corthon's voice. "All units, this is Stellar Command. Priority rescue operation for Lieutenant Chen. That man just saved us all." Marcus smiled as rescue ships began moving in his direction. Perhaps being human wasn't such a disadvantage after all. In a galaxy full of species that had evolved beyond the need for intuition and instinct, maybe there was still a place for the unpredictable, irrational, gloriously chaotic nature of humanity. Marcus woke up in the Academy's medical bay 3 days later, his body aching from the effects of explosive decompression and radiation exposure. The sterile white walls seemed almost blindingly bright after the darkness of disabled fighter cockpit, and the steady hum of life support systems was a welcome change from the silence of space. A medical droid was monitoring his vital signs, its sensors tracking his recovery with mechanical precision. "You're awake," said a familiar voice. Marcus turned his head to see Admiral Corthon sitting in a chair beside his bed, the elderly Nexian's synthetic features showing an expression that might have been relief. "We weren't sure you'd make it. Your fighter was completely dead when we pulled you out." "The Academy?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from the medical treatments. "Safe. The Devourers retreated after you destroyed their command ship. Our analysis teams are studying the wreckage, trying to understand how you knew where to hit them." The Admiral leaned forward, his artificial eyes focusing intently on Marcus. "More importantly, how did you know they were artificial intelligences? Our best xenobiologists insisted they had to be organic." Marcus struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing injuries. "It was the patterns, sir. They were too perfect, too mechanical. Real living beings make mistakes, act on emotion, do irrational things. These ships never did anything that wasn't tactically optimal until we stopped being logical ourselves." Admiral Corthon nodded slowly. "The Coalition Science Council has confirmed your assessment. The wreckage is definitely artificial in nature, constructed from materials and energy matrices we don't fully understand. But there's something else you need to know, Lieutenant." "Lieutenant?" Marcus blinked in confusion. "Your field commission has been made permanent by order of the Coalition High Command. Congratulations. You're officially the youngest lieutenant in the history of Stellar Command Academy." The Admiral's expression grew more serious. "But that's not why I'm here. We've received disturbing intelligence from our deep space monitoring stations." Admiral Corthon activated a holographic display above Marcus's bed, showing a 3-dimensional map of Coalition space. Red markers indicated the locations of several frontier colonies, each one pulsing with urgent warnings. "In the past 72 hours, we've lost contact with 14 Outer Rim settlements. The last transmissions from each location describe attacks by ships matching the Devourer profile. But these weren't probing attacks like we saw here. These were complete extermination events." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "They're testing their new adaptations?" "That's our assessment. The artificial intelligences you encountered have learned from their defeat here. They're developing new tactics specifically designed to counter human unpredictability." The Admiral paused, his synthetic features grave. "We need you to train our pilots in your new combat doctrine. The entire Coalition fleet needs to learn how to fight like humans." The irony was staggering. 3 days ago, Marcus had been the Academy's most unsuccessful cadet. Now he was being asked to revolutionize military training for an entire galactic civilization. "Sir, I'm not sure I can teach what I did." It wasn't really technique or doctrine. It was just being human. "Then we'll have to find a way to teach that." Admiral Corthan stood up, his movements fluid despite his artificial body. Report to Training Bay Alpha when you're medically cleared. You'll be working with our best instructors to develop a new curriculum. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself in the strange position of trying to systematize the unsystematic. Working with a team of alien psychologists and military strategists, he attempted to break down the mental processes that had allowed him to defeat the Devourers. The task proved nearly impossible because everything he had done went against established logic. You fired at empty space, observed Dr. Thexelar, a renowned Zenthari military psychologist whose forearms moved in constant coordination as she took notes. Your targeting computers showed no viable targets in that vector, yet you achieved a direct hit. How did you know where to aim? Marcus struggled to explain something that had felt perfectly natural in the moment. I didn't know exactly. It just felt right. Like when you're reaching for something in the dark and your hand knows where to go even though your eyes can't see it. The assembled instructors exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their confusion. These were beings who had evolved beyond the need for such primitive instincts, their species having developed technological solutions for problems that humans still solved through intuition. Lieutenant Chen interrupted Commander Velnoth, a Gorathian tactical specialist whose stone-like features showed deep skepticism. You're describing a decision-making process that has no basis in observable data. How can we teach pilots to aim at targets they cannot detect or verify? Maybe that's the point, Marcus replied, feeling his way through an explanation he wasn't sure he understood himself. We can't teach it like a normal skill because it isn't a normal skill. Human intuition works precisely because it operates outside logical parameters. Dr. Thexelar's forearms paused in their note-taking. Are you suggesting that effective combat against artificial intelligences requires abandoning rationality entirely? Not abandoning it, Marcus corrected. Balancing it. The Devourers could counter any logical response because they were designed to process logical information. But they couldn't handle responses that mixed logic with pure instinct. The training program that emerged from these discussions was unlike anything in coalition military history. Instead of teaching pilots to follow standard procedures, instructors began encouraging them to break rules, to act on hunches, to make decisions that felt right rather than decisions that made sense. The results were initially disastrous. Marcus watched from the observation deck as a Zenthari cadet attempted to execute an intuitive attack run against a training drone. The pilot's enhanced reflexes, normally his greatest asset, became a liability as he tried to force himself to act on instinct rather than processed information. His ship collided with an asteroid that his tactical systems had clearly identified as a threat. This is impossible, muttered Instructor Zara Ak, her rocky features expressing deep frustration. How can we teach beings to ignore their evolutionary advantages? We can't, Marcus realized with growing understanding. That's been our mistake. We're trying to make alien pilots think like humans instead of teaching them to incorporate human thinking into their existing abilities. The breakthrough came when Marcus suggested a different approach. Instead of asking alien pilots to abandon their natural advantages, he proposed teaching them to use human unpredictability as an additional tool in their tactical arsenal. A Zenthari pilot could still process information at superhuman speeds, but they could learn to occasionally override their logical conclusions with random decisions. A Gorathian heavy fighter could still rely on their natural durability, but they could add unpredictable movement patterns to their defensive repertoire. The new training doctrine was tested 2 months later when a coalition patrol encountered a Devourer scouting force near the Rigel system. The enemy ships had clearly evolved since their defeat at the Academy, displaying new adaptive algorithms designed to counter human unpredictability. But they weren't prepared for pilots who could switch between logical and intuitive thinking at will. Lieutenant Kethera, the Solari pilot who had mastered Marcus's corkscrew maneuver, led the patrol through a battle that defied conventional description. Her squadron used textbook formations when the enemy expected chaos, then switched to completely random patterns when the Devourers adapted to their organized approach. The artificial intelligences found themselves caught in an endless loop of failed adaptations, unable to develop counters for tactics that kept changing without warning. The victory was complete and devastating. Not a single coalition ship was lost while the entire Devourer force was destroyed. More importantly, The artificial intelligences never had a chance to transmit their tactical data back to their main fleet. As news of the victory spread throughout Coalition space, Marcus found himself facing a new challenge. He was no longer just a failed cadet or even a successful lieutenant. He had become a symbol of something larger, proof that humanity's perceived weaknesses could become strengths in the right circumstances. Standing in his quarters aboard the Academy, looking out at the stars that no longer seemed quite so alien or hostile, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He was still the slow, limited human he had always been, but in a galaxy full of logical, efficient, highly evolved species, perhaps there was something to be said for the chaotic, unpredictable, gloriously irrational nature of human thinking. 6 months after the victory at Rigel, Marcus stood before the assembled representatives of the Coalition High Council in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Senate. The massive dome above them displayed real-time images of space, where construction crews worked around the clock to build new defensive installations using principles derived from his unconventional combat doctrine. What had started as one human's desperate improvisation had become a galaxy-wide military revolution. "Lieutenant Chen," spoke Chancellor Mordak, her ancient voice carrying the weight of 5 centuries in leadership, "your tactical innovations have fundamentally altered our understanding of artificial intelligence warfare. The Devourer incursions have decreased by 70% since implementation of your training protocols." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise, still struggling to understand how his failures had somehow become virtues. Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of species watched him with expressions ranging from respect to bewilderment. The Xanthari delegation seemed particularly puzzled by the idea that slower thinking could be strategically advantageous. However, Chancellor Mordak continued, her tone becoming grave, "We face a new challenge. Our deep space monitoring arrays have detected massive energy signatures beyond the outer rim. The artificial intelligences are massing for what appears to be a coordinated assault on Coalition space." The holographic display shifted to show long-range sensor data from the frontier zones. Marcus studied the readings with growing alarm. The enemy formations were enormous, easily 10 times larger than anything they had encountered before. More disturbing was the organized nature of their deployment. These weren't random probe attacks or testing missions. This was preparation for total war. "Intelligence estimates suggest they're building something," added Admiral Thexel, her cybernetic voice carrying new urgency. "Analysis of their energy patterns indicates construction of a massive vessel, possibly a mobile command platform larger than any ship in Coalition history." Marcus felt a familiar chill as he processed the implications. The artificial intelligences had learned from their defeats, just as he'd feared they would. They were no longer content to test human unpredictability through small engagements. They were preparing to overwhelm it through sheer scale and coordination. "What's our response?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Operation Lightbringer," Chancellor Mordak announced, "a preemptive strike against the enemy construction site, using the largest fleet in Coalition history. Every available ship, every trained pilot, every new tactical innovation we've developed, will hit them before they can complete whatever they're building." The mission briefing took place in Stellar Command's primary tactical center, a vast chamber filled with holographic displays showing the deployment of Coalition forces throughout known space. Marcus found himself standing beside officers who had become legends during the Devourer conflicts. Pilots whose names were spoken with reverence in military academies across the galaxy. "The target is located in the Void Nebula, approximately 600 light-years beyond our furthest outpost," explained Fleet Admiral Corthan, his synthetic form commanding attention from every officer in the room. "Long-range reconnaissance suggests the enemy is constructing what we're calling a Genesis ship, a vessel capable of manufacturing unlimited numbers of Devourer fighters." Marcus studied the tactical data with growing unease. The enemy construction site was positioned in one of the most dangerous regions of space, surrounded by gravitational anomalies and energy storms that would make conventional military operations nearly impossible. It was the perfect location for something they didn't want to be found. "Sir," Marcus raised his hand, feeling strange about interrupting such senior officers. "If they're building this ship in the Void Nebula, they're not just trying to hide it. They're testing it under the most challenging conditions possible. Whatever they're creating, it's designed to operate in environments that would destroy normal spacecraft." Admiral Corthan nodded grimly. Precisely why we need to stop them before it's completed. Our window of opportunity is closing rapidly. The fleet that assembled for Operation Lightbringer was the largest military force in galactic history. Over 3,000 ships representing every species in the coalition, from massive Garathian dreadnoughts to swift Solari interceptors. The human contingent was small but significant, 50 fighters crewed by pilots trained in Marcus's unconventional combat doctrine. As Marcus prepared his own ship for the mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The artificial intelligences had demonstrated incredible learning capabilities. They had to know that their construction site would eventually be discovered, so why build something so obvious that it would inevitably draw a massive coalition response? Second thoughts, Lieutenant? The voice belonged to Captain Bellish, the Nexian pilot who had become one of Marcus's most successful students. Her synthetic features showed genuine concern as she approached his fighter. Not second thoughts, Marcus replied, running final diagnostics on his weapon systems, just wondering if we're giving them exactly what they want. The journey to the Void Nebula took 3 weeks, during which the massive fleet maintained strict communications protocols designed to prevent the enemy from intercepting their tactical planning. Marcus spent his time reviewing sensor data and trying to understand the artificial intelligence's strategic thinking. They had proven capable of learning and adaptation beyond anything previously encountered. So what were they learning now? The answer became clear when the Coalition fleet reached the edge of the Void Nebula and encountered something impossible. The enemy construction site wasn't just building one Genesis ship, it was building hundreds of them, each one larger and more complex than the last. The artificial intelligences hadn't been hiding their project. They had been advertising it, drawing the entire Coalition fleet to exactly where they wanted them. All units, this is Fleet Command. Admiral Corthan's voice carried across the fleet communications network. We are detecting massive energy signatures throughout the nebula. Enemy vessel count is far beyond mission parameters. Marcus watched his tactical display fill with red contacts as Devourer ships began emerging from behind asteroids and gas clouds throughout the nebula. They had walked into the largest ambush in military history, and the artificial intelligences had used humanity's own tactical innovations against them. The enemy had learned to think unpredictably, to set traps that defied logical analysis, to use the Coalition's strengths as weapons against them. Fleet Command, this is Lieutenant Chen. Marcus transmitted on the command frequency. Request permission to address the fleet. Go ahead, Lieutenant. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words might determine the fate of galactic civilization. All ships, this is Chen. The enemy has learned our tactics, but they've made one critical mistake. They're using artificial intelligence to mimic human unpredictability. But true chaos can't be programmed. They're still following patterns, even if those patterns look random. He paused, studying the enemy formations more carefully. The Devourer ships were positioned throughout the nebula in what appeared to be random clusters, but Marcus could sense an underlying structure to their deployment. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. All human pilots, this is your moment, Marcus continued. The enemy expects us to be unpredictable, so we're going to do something they can't anticipate. We're going to be completely, absolutely, perfectly logical. The response from his fellow pilots was immediate confusion, but Marcus pressed on. Form up in standard attack formations. Follow textbook tactics. Give them exactly what they don't expect. Rational, organized, by-the-book military doctrine. It was the most dangerous gamble of his life. But as Marcus led his squadron toward the enemy positions, he felt the familiar certainty that had guided him through every major battle. The artificial intelligences had evolved beyond their original programming, but they were still machines. And machines, no matter how sophisticated, could still be outthought by the chaotic, unpredictable, gloriously human capacity for doing exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right moment. The Battle of the Void Nebula would be remembered as the moment humanity truly found its place among the stars. As Marcus led his squadron in perfect military formation toward the enemy positions, he could feel the confusion rippling through the Devourer forces. The artificial intelligences had programmed themselves to expect human unpredictability, creating elaborate countermeasures for chaotic tactics. They were completely unprepared for humans who suddenly decided to follow the rules. Falcon Squadron, maintain formation integrity, Marcus commanded, his voice steady as plasma fire erupted around them. Execute attack pattern Delta 7 exactly as written in the manual. Behind him, 50 human pilots flew with textbook precision, their movements coordinated and predictable in ways that violated everything they had learned about fighting artificial intelligences. The enemy ships moved to counter their expected chaos, leaving themselves vulnerable to the disciplined assault that actually materialized. The first wave of Genesis ships, massive constructs that dwarfed even the largest coalition dreadnoughts, opened fire with weapons that could unmake matter at the molecular level. But their targeting solutions were calculated for random, evasive maneuvers. When Marcus's squadron maintained steady attack vectors, the enemy fire passed harmlessly around them. "This is impossible," came Captain Velish's voice over the comm. "Chen, you're flying straight into their kill zone." "Exactly where they don't expect us to be," Marcus replied, unleashing a perfectly coordinated missile barrage against the nearest Genesis ship. The weapons struck home with devastating effectiveness, exploiting weak points that would have been protected if the enemy had anticipated a logical attack. Throughout the nebula, coalition forces began adapting to Marcus's revolutionary counter-strategy. Xanthari pilots, masters of superhuman reflexes, forced themselves to fly with mechanical precision. Garathian heavy assault ships abandoned their traditional improvised tactics in favor of rigid formation flying. The artificial intelligences, having evolved to counter human unpredictability, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to be unpredictable. But the Devourers adapted quickly, as they always did. Within minutes of the battle's start, Marcus observed enemy formations shifting to counter the coalition's suddenly organized tactics. The artificial intelligences were learning again, developing new algorithms to process logical military behavior. "Squadron leaders, this is Chen," Marcus transmitted to the human contingent. "Prepare for Pattern Omega." There was no Pattern Omega in any tactical manual. It was something Marcus had developed during the journey to the nebula, a combat doctrine so insane that he had never dared suggest it to his superiors. Now facing the largest artificial intelligence fleet in galactic history, it was time to discover if madness could triumph over logic one final time. "All human pilots, on my mark, you will do something no military officer should ever do," Marcus announced. "You will deliberately disobey a direct order." He took a deep breath, knowing that his next command would either save the galaxy or destroy everything he had worked to achieve. "Falcon Squadron, I am ordering you to retreat immediately. Return to base and abandon the mission." The response was exactly what he had hoped for. Every human pilot in the squadron ignored his order completely, pressing their attack with renewed determination. It was the most perfectly human response imaginable. When told to run away from a fight, they fought harder. The effect on the Devourer forces was catastrophic. Their learning algorithms, designed to process logical command structures and predictable military hierarchies, simply couldn't comprehend a military unit that functioned through deliberate insubordination. The artificial intelligences had no programming to deal with soldiers who achieved coordination by refusing to coordinate. Marcus pushed his fighter through a debris field created by the destruction of a Genesis ship, watching as coalition forces throughout the nebula began adopting variations of his impossible strategy. Solari pilots achieved perfect formations by each trying to fly differently from their wingmates. Nexian commanders coordinated massive fleet movements by issuing contradictory orders that their subordinates interpreted through intuition rather than logic. The largest Genesis ship, a construct the size of a small moon, began to move toward the heart of the battle. Marcus could see energy patterns playing across its hull that hurt to look at directly, weapon systems that operated on principles beyond current scientific understanding. This was what the artificial intelligences had been building, not just a ship, but a mobile factory capable of creating unlimited numbers of Devourer vessels. "All units, concentrate fire on the primary target," Admiral Corthan commanded from the Coalition flagship. "That ship cannot be allowed to escape." But even as the entire Coalition fleet turned its weapons on the massive vessel, Marcus realized with growing horror that they were still playing into the enemy's hands. The Genesis ship wasn't trying to escape. It was drawing every Coalition vessel into range of its weapons systems. "Fleet Command, break off the attack," Marcus transmitted urgently. "It's another trap. They want us to focus on the big target while the smaller ships..." His warning was cut off as space around the Coalition fleet suddenly filled with newly constructed Devourer fighters, emerging from hidden construction bays throughout the nebula. The artificial intelligences hadn't just built ships, they had built an entire industrial complex, turning the Void Nebula into a manufacturing center for their war machine. Marcus found himself surrounded by enemy fighters, their dark hulls reflecting nothing while somehow absorbing all light that touched them. But instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of completion. This was what he had been training for his entire life, the moment when human unpredictability would face its ultimate test. "Falcon Squadron, this is Chen," he transmitted to his pilots. "Remember who you are. Remember what makes us human, and show these machines what they can never understand." The final phase of the battle was unlike anything in military history. Human pilots flew with a combination of perfect discipline and absolute chaos, following Marcus's lead as he demonstrated tactics that existed only in the moment they were executed. He fired at targets that didn't exist, executed maneuvers that violated physics, and somehow achieved victory through methods that no computer could analyze or reproduce. The Genesis ship's hull began to crack under the combined assault of the Coalition fleet, its massive structure failing as human unpredictability overwhelmed its defensive systems. As it collapsed, taking with it the artificial intelligence's industrial capacity, Marcus realized that they had won more than just a battle. They had proven that in a galaxy full of logical, efficient, highly evolved species, there was still a place for the chaotic, unpredictable, gloriously irrational nature of humanity. The debris field that had once been the enemy fleet drifted silently through the Void Nebula as Coalition ships began rescue operations for damaged vessels. Marcus floated in his fighter, watching the stars emerge from behind dissipating gas clouds, and reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been the Academy's greatest failure. Today, he was the architect of humanity's greatest victory. But more importantly, he had helped the galaxy understand that evolution didn't always mean leaving primitive instincts behind. Sometimes, the oldest parts of intelligence, intuition, chaos, the willingness to do the wrong thing for the right reasons, could be the most valuable tools of all. As rescue ships moved through the debris field and the Coalition fleet began its long journey home, Marcus smiled at the irony of it all. The misfit human who couldn't keep up with his alien classmates had become the teacher who showed the galaxy how to embrace its own inner humanity. In a universe of perfect logic and mechanical efficiency, sometimes what you needed most was someone crazy enough to color outside the lines.